At its peak, 1 in 10 British Christmas stockings held a Terry's chocolate orange, moulded, wrapped and boxed beneath a clock tower that spelled the company's name across the skyline of York. Today, that tower rises over luxury apartments. The moulding lines are gone, the wrapping machines are gone. Where 5 stories of gravity-fed chocolate production once filled the building with the deep, warm scent of roasting cocoa, there are fitted wardrobes and underfloor heating, and a silence so complete you can hear the wind in the stairwell. The clock stopped the day the factory closed. It didn't tick again for 18 years. When it was finally restored, the original mechanism had vanished. Nobody knows where. They had to build a new one. A family business that lasted 238 years. 6 corporate owners in 4 decades. A trade union official who watched it happen had a phrase for what they did. He called it death by stealth, and by the time anyone understood what that meant, the machinery was already on a lorry bound for Poland. There's a clock tower in the south of York that stands 135 feet tall. 4 faces, no numerals, just letters, TERRYSYORK. Picked out against white enamel, visible from half a mile in every direction. For 79 years, those faces told the time. Workers glanced up at them on their way through the gates. Mothers in terraced kitchens on Bishopthorpe Road used them to judge when dinner needed starting. Children learned to read the hours from their bedroom windows. Locals had a saying about someone they didn't trust, that he had more faces than the Terry's clock. It was a landmark, a timekeeper, and a compass point for an entire neighbourhood. On the 30th of September 2005, the clock stopped. It didn't break. Nobody smashed the mechanism or pulled a fuse. The factory beneath it simply closed, and the gents' waiting train electric turret clock, one of possibly only 2 of its kind still working anywhere in Britain, fell silent because there was nobody left to wind it. 316 workers walked out for the last time. The machines that had hummed and clattered and poured chocolate since 1926 went quiet. And a clock that had marked every shift change, every tea break, every Christmas rush for the best part of a century just stopped. It wouldn't tick again for 18 years. Stand at the foot of that tower today and you'll find luxury apartments where the production floors used to be, gloss kitchen cabinets where the moulding lines ran, underfloor heating where the conching machines once shook the building with their slow, grinding rhythm. The red brick is immaculate. The sandstone dressings have been cleaned. The Art Deco facade looks, if anything, better than it did in 1930. But step inside, and every trace of what this building was, the roasting, the pouring, the wrapping, the noise, the heat, the smell, has been scraped out as thoroughly as if it never existed. The shell survived. The soul didn't. This is the story of Terry's of York. 238 years of confectionery, from a Georgian apothecary's shop to the factory that gave Britain the chocolate orange, and how it was hollowed out, piece by piece, by owners who wanted the brand but never wanted the place. It's a story about chocolate, and about what chocolate meant to the people who made it, about a clock that kept time for a city, and the silence that followed when it stopped. It begins, as these stories often do, not with chocolate at all, but with a young man, a marriage, and an apothecary's instinct for what people wanted to put in their mouths. Joseph Terry was not born into confectionery, he was born into farming, the son of Thomas Terry and Elizabeth Dale, delivered on the 11th of November 1793 in the small market town of Pocklington, 15 miles east of York, across the flat, open farmland of the East Riding. What made a farmer's son leave the land for a chemist's shop? The records don't say. But by 1815, Joseph had completed an apothecary's apprenticeship in York. Accounts differ on whether it was Stonegate, Spurriergate, or Walmgate, but the city was the same and set up his own practice. He was 22, a qualified chemist, trained to compound medicines, mix tinctures, and understand what ingredients did when you combined them. It was a useful education for someone who'd shortly find himself in the business of sugar and spice and everything that sold. His route into sweets came through a door that only marriage could open. In 1823, Joseph married Harriet Atkinson. Harriet's sister was married to Robert Berry, who along with his partner William Baildon ran a confectionery business at number 3 St Helens Square, a handsome address near the Mansion House in the commercial heart of York. Baildon and Berry had been trading since 1767, selling cough lozenges, candied peel and boiled sweets from a shop that sat on the blurred line between pharmacy and sweet counter. Baildon had retired around 1821. Berry was running the operation alone, and when Berry died in 1825, the business needed someone who understood both the chemistry of confection and the rhythms of trade. Joseph Dabal, Berry's brother-in-law, a trained compounder of medicines, a man who knew what happened when you heated sugar to different temperatures, was the obvious choice. He partnered briefly with Berry's son George, trading as Terry and Berry, but George departed in 1828, and Joseph became sole proprietor of a business that had been running in one form or another for over 60 years. What he did with it was remarkable. The product range in those early years reads like a document from a world that hadn't yet decided where pharmacy ended and confectionery began. Conversation lozenges. Small pressed sweets stamped with phrases like, "Can you polka?" and "Do you flirt?" The ancestors of love hearts. Medicated lozenges for coughs and colds. Candied eringo root, which was sea holly, considered a digestive. Colt's foot rock. Marzipan. Mushroom ketchup, anchovy paste, and alongside all of it, the sugar confections that would eventually swallow everything else, boiled sweets, candied peel, comfits, and the first experiments with chocolate. Joseph understood distribution the way a modern entrepreneur might understand algorithms. The Northeastern Railway was expanding rapidly through the 1830s and 40s, linking York to towns across the north of England, and Joseph exploited it with an energy that bordered on ruthless. By the 1840s, he'd established retail agencies in 75 towns, a network that turned a single York shop into something approaching a regional brand. Described in later accounts as balding and rotund, with plenty of side hair and mutton chop whiskers, he was not a man content to wait for customers to come to him. He also had a conscience about his trade, or at least a public one. In 1836, he campaigned against the widespread adulteration of confectionery, specifically lozenges manufactured with plaster of Paris, which was cheap, bulked up the product, and was quietly poisoning the people who ate them. Whether this was moral conviction or commercial strategy, a clean brand distancing itself from dirty competitors, the effect was the same. Joseph Terry's name became associated with quality. Now, here's a distinction that matters, because it gets muddled in almost every popular account of York's chocolate history. Joseph Terry was not a Quaker. His family were Church of England. This matters because the three great dynasties that made British chocolate famous, Cadbury in Birmingham, Rowntree in York, Fry in Bristol, were all Quaker families, and their faith shaped everything about how they ran their businesses. The model villages, the worker welfare programs, the temperance advocacy, the social reform. The Terrys operated within York's chocolate world, but from an entirely different tradition. Sir Joseph Terry Jr. would become a conservative politician, a committed Freemason, and a knight of the realm. Three things no practicing Quaker of that era would have contemplated. The Terrys were civic-minded through paternalism, not through the religious society of friends. They looked after their workers. But the impulse came from a different place. By the time Joseph died on the 8th of June 1850, the business employed 127 people, the second largest employer in York. From a farmer's son to the city's second most significant paymaster in 35 years. Not bad for a man who'd started life compounding cough remedies in a rented shop. He left behind a wife, a business, and a model for growth that his descendants would follow for the next century and a half. What he couldn't leave them was any protection against what would happen when the family name became more valuable than the family itself. Joseph's legacy passed to his sons, and it was the second of them, Sir Joseph Terry Jr., who turned a successful confectionery business into something approaching an industrial empire. Born in 1828, educated at St. Peter's School in York, a detail that signals how far the family had already climbed from Pocklington farming stock, Joseph Jr. took control in 1854 alongside his brothers Robert and John, renaming the firm Joseph Terry and Sons. He was 26. The business had outgrown St. Helens Square. It needed space, power, and the kind of infrastructure that a shop above a Georgian shopfront couldn't provide. Around 1862, he moved production to a new steam-powered factory at Clementhorpe, on the banks of the River Ouse. Twice a week, packets arrived from Hull carrying the raw materials of confectionery. Sugar, cocoa, glucose, and citrus rinds, shipped upriver and unloaded at the factory's own wharf. It was a shrewd location, river access for materials, the railway nearby for distribution, and enough space to expand as the business grew. And grow it did. By 1867, the price list contained 400 items. But here's the thing that surprises people. Only 13 of those 400 products were chocolate. The rest were confectionery, cakes, biscuits, candied fruits, and preserves. Terry's was still at heart a sweets and fancies operation. Chocolate was a sideline. It wouldn't become the main event for another 2 decades. That changed in 1886, when a dedicated chocolate factory was added at Clementhorpe. The first boxed assortment, called Britannia, came off the line, and Terry's began the transformation from general confectioner to chocolate manufacturer. The timing was shrewd. Britain's appetite for eating chocolate, as distinct from drinking chocolate, was growing rapidly, and York was already becoming the national capital of the trade. Rowntree's was expanding on the other side of the city. Craven's occupied another corner. The 3 firms together were turning York into something remarkable. A city that smelled, quite literally, of chocolate. Sir Joseph Jr. served as Lord Mayor of York on multiple occasions. He was knighted during Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887. He transformed the original St. Helens Square premises into a celebrated restaurant and ballroom, a statement of civic arrival that survived until 1981. When he died in 1898, he left behind a business with international reach and a family name that had become synonymous with York itself. His son Thomas expanded trade to Australia and New Zealand, pushing the brand into the empire's furthest markets. But Thomas was killed in a road traffic accident in 1910, a death that shifted the family's trajectory and placed the business in the hands of 2 men who would, between them, create everything Terry's is remembered for. The first was Sir Francis Terry, Frank Chines, born in 1877, Thomas's brother. Described as a perfectionist, Frank ran production for 35 years as chairman, obsessing over the quality of the chocolate itself, the roasting temperatures, the conching times, the flavour profiles. He was knighted in 1936. Everything about the product that people would later call irreplaceable, the richness, the snap, the particular way a Terry's chocolate dissolved on the tongue, bore Frank's fingerprints. The second was Noel Goddard Terry, Thomas's son, born in 1889. Noel had served with the 3rd and 5th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment in the First World War, was seriously wounded in 1916, and invalided out. He married Kathleen Leatham in 1915. Her father, Henry Ernest Leatham, a York flour miller, served as chairman from 1915 to 1923 while the Terry men were at war. When normalcy returned, Frank and Noel became joint managing directors, Frank overseeing production, Noel overseeing sales. It was a partnership of craftsman and commercial mind, and it worked. Noel commissioned Goddard's, an arts and crafts mansion on Tadcaster Road, designed by Walter Brierley and completed in 1927, built within sight of the factory clock tower he was about to erect. He could stand in his garden and see the building that his family had raised. Today, Goddard's is a National Trust property, housing Yorkshire's regional headquarters. Noel's son Kenneth would be killed in action in 1944. A lectern at York Minster Choir commemorates him. His other son, Peter, would become the last Terry to serve in the business, retiring in 1985. But all of that was ahead of them. In 1923, Frank and Noel stood on a patch of agricultural land off Bishopthorpe Road, adjacent to the Knavesmire and York Racecourse, and they made a decision that would define their family's legacy. The cramped, piecemeal Clementhorpe works was choking growth. They needed something built from scratch, purpose-designed, modern and worthy of the name. They were going to build a chocolate castle. The site was 14 acres of previously agricultural land on well-drained glacial moraine, about 2 kilometres south of York's medieval walls. Frank and Noel Terry purchased it in 1923 and appointed architects J.G. Davies and L.E. Wade to design something that would be simultaneously a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility and a statement of civic pride. The construction contract went to Dorman Long, the same engineering firm that would build the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Tyne Bridge. This was not a company that built sheds. The message was clear. This factory was going to be a monument. Construction ran from 1924 to 1930, with production beginning in 1926. The first chocolates rolling off the new lines before the complex was even finished. What emerged was a unified Art Deco campus of 5 principal buildings, and it was extraordinary. The main factory was a 5-storey steel-framed building approximately 500 feet long. Red brick laid in English bond, creamy sandstone ashlar dressings, Tuscan columns flanking the entrances, mullioned windows that gave the thing an almost civic grandeur. You'd have been forgiven for thinking it was a town hall or a university, not a place where cocoa beans were roasted and chocolate poured into moulds. But the real genius was inside. The building was designed around gravity. Raw cocoa arrived at the upper floors where it was roasted, filling the top stories with an intense, deep, nutty heat that you could feel through the soles of your shoes. The roasted beans progressed downward through grinding on the intermediate levels where the conching machines worked the chocolate for hours, refining the texture with a slow, relentless mechanical rhythm that vibrated through the entire structure. By the time the chocolate reached the ground floor, it was tempered, moulded, enrobed, and wrapped, emerging as finished product at the loading bays without ever having been carried uphill. Gravity did the heavy lifting. It was elegant, efficient, and decades ahead of its time. The head office featured a grand staircase that workers nicknamed the Titanic staircase, lit from above by a glass dome skylight. The time office stood at the factory gates, where workers clocked in and out, the threshold between home life and the chocolate floor. A liquor store housed the coffee beans, rum and other ingredients for the chocolate liqueurs and truffles that would become the heart of the all-gold range. And rising above it all, the clock tower. 135 feet of brick and ashlar, built in 6 diminishing stages, crowned with a cast-iron water tank that served the factory's fire suppression system. Its 4 faces bore no numerals, just the letters spelling Terry's York, each one large enough to read from the streets of South York. The mechanism inside was a gents waiting train electric turret clock, manufactured in Leicester, believed at the time of its eventual silencing to be one of possibly only 2 of its kind still working in Britain. It was in every sense the heartbeat of the place. When that clock was running, the factory was alive. During the Second World War, the tower served as a fire-watching station, men scanning the skies for German bombers, while the factory below them turned out troop rations instead of chocolate oranges. The tower survived. The factory survived. The clock kept ticking. Imagine standing on Bishopthorpe Road in 1930, watching this thing take shape. A farmer's great-grandson had built a chocolate palace on the edge of the Knavesmire, designed by the people who'd bridged Sydney Harbour, and fitted it with a clock that an entire neighbourhood would set their lives by. It was ambition made solid, and the best was still to come. The first chocolate fruit to roll off the Bishopthorpe Road production line wasn't the one you're thinking of. It was an apple. The Terry's chocolate apple launched in 1926, the same year the new factory opened for business. It was a novelty, a chocolate ball in the shape of an apple, wrapped in foil. But it suffered from a fundamental problem that seems obvious in hindsight. Apples don't have natural segments. You couldn't break it apart. You couldn't share it. You just bit into it. The ritual that would later make the chocolate orange iconic, the tap, the unwrap, the satisfying separation of 20 perfect wedges, simply didn't exist. The apple sold steadily for almost 3 decades before being quietly phased out in 1954 during post-war cocoa rationing, when resources were redirected to its far more successful sibling. A lone surviving example sits in York Castle Museum, a curiosity from a road not taken. The chocolate orange launched in 1932. Originally called the Dessert Chocolate Orange, it was developed under the joint leadership of Frank and Noel Terry, and it was, in its way, a small masterpiece of confectionery engineering. The concept was simple: an orange-shaped sphere of chocolate blended with natural orange oil, divided into 20 segments replicating the anatomy of a real citrus fruit, wrapped in foil printed to resemble orange skin. The execution was anything but simple. Each of the 20 segments was moulded individually in single-sided moulds, which is why the Terry's imprint appears on only one face of each slice. The segments were then carefully arranged into a sphere, and warm-tempered chocolate was dripped into the centre of the ball, bonding everything together as it cooled and set. When you tapped the finished orange on a hard surface, the impact broke the chocolate bond at the centre, and the segments fell apart cleanly. 20 identical wedges, each one a perfect miniature of a citrus segment. It was satisfying in a way that most confectionery isn't. The tap was a ritual. The unwrapping was a reveal. The sharing was built into the design. 20 segments for a family, or for keeping to yourself if you were that way inclined. There was something genuinely clever about it, a marriage of form and flavour that transcended the usual chocolate-in-a-box formula. Frank Terry's perfectionism was all over it. At its peak, it was estimated that 1 in 10 British Christmas stockings contained a chocolate orange. 1 in 10. For a single product from a single factory in a single city, that's a staggering penetration of national life. The advertising became part of the culture. Tap it and unwrap it gave way to the 1982 Jungle advert, a Raiders of the Lost Ark pastiche with the tagline, "How safe is yours?" And then, from 1997 to 2007, the decade-long partnership with Dawn French. Her catchphrase, "It's not Terry's, it's mine." And the later evolution to, "So, don't tap it, whack it," embedded the product so deeply into the national consciousness that people who'd never set foot in York felt a personal connection to it. A year before the orange, in 1931, Terry's launched All Gold. If the orange was the democratic crowd pleaser, All Gold was the aspirational gift, a luxury assortment of up to 22 different centres. Rum truffles, soft fruit fondants, hard caramels, cherry, ginger, pineapple. Each one nested in a gold-trimmed box that Noel Terry fussed over with the attention of a jeweller designing a display case. A 1930 catalogue captured his philosophy. The purchaser of today expects a chocolate box to be worthy of the confections it contains. In distinction of design and harmony of colours, it must reflect the quality of the chocolates within. By 1977, Terry's held 30% of the entire UK assortment box market. All Gold alone accounted for 20%. It was the quintessential Christmas gift box, the thing you bought for your mum, your aunt, the neighbour who'd looked after your cat. By 1981, All Gold revenue had reached £11 million. The product range extended further. Neapolitans, individually wrapped chocolate squares in milk, plain, mocha, café au lait, orange, and mint crisp, had been in production since 1899, making them the first mass-produced individually wrapped chocolate squares in Britain. Twilight offered dark chocolate mint fondant. Pyramint was a dark chocolate pyramid. Wafer, launched in 1952, was Terry's answer to Kit Kat. York fruits were flavoured jellies. And a commemorative 1767 selection, created by Frank Terry himself, honoured the year William Baildon first opened his shop near Bootham Bar. Terry's also held a royal warrant. During packing of the royal chocolates, an official oversaw the entire process and the doors were locked to prevent contamination. This was chocolate that went to the Queen. These weren't just products, they were rituals. The chocolate orange at Christmas, the all-gold box on Mother's Day, the Neapolitans after dinner. Terry's had woven itself into the texture of British domestic life so thoroughly that most people never thought about where these things actually came from. They just appeared, year after year, as reliable as the clock tower that watched over the factory where they were made. By 1937, the Bishopthorpe Road Works employed approximately 2,500 people. It was the absolute zenith of the family era, the highest the workforce would ever climb under Terry ownership. On the 19th of October that year, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth toured the factory. They walked the production lines and visited the testing laboratories, while workers cheered from behind ribbons and banners, a marching band playing somewhere in the background. It was a coronation year visit, and the pride was tangible, a royal stamp on a business that had grown from a sweet shop to a national institution in 170 years. But the numbers only tell you scale. They don't tell you what it was like. The workforce was overwhelmingly local. Women formed roughly 60% of the factory floor, young women from the terraced streets of South York, many of whom followed their mothers into the trade. One former worker recalled the reason simply: "I decided to follow my mother into the trade because she smelt so nice of chocolate when she came back from work." That detail, the scent of chocolate carried home in hair and clothes and skin, tells you more about daily life at Terry's than any production statistic could. Imagine arriving for the morning shift. You'd walk from the terraced houses on the streets south of the Knavesmire, past the corner shops and the pubs that existed because the factory existed, through the gates beneath the time office where you clocked in, and into a building that hit you with a wall of warmth and sweetness the moment you crossed the threshold. The upper floors were the hottest. The cocoa roasters generated fierce, dry heat, and the aroma up there was overwhelming. Deep, nutty, almost smoky, with a bitterness underneath that caught the back of your throat. As you descended, the character of the air changed. The grinding floors smelled of cocoa butter and raw chocolate, rich and fatty. The conching rooms thrummed with the slow mechanical pulse of machines that worked the chocolate for hours, refining it to a smoothness you could feel on your tongue. By the ground floor, where the moulding and wrapping happened, the smell was sweeter, tempered chocolate, warm and glossy, being poured into moulds and cooled into the shapes that would end up in shops across the country. The noise was constant, not deafening, like a steelworks or a shipyard, but pervasive, a layered mechanical hum that you felt through the floor as much as heard through your ears. The conching machines had a particular rhythm, a slow grinding that became the building's heartbeat. Wrapping machines clattered, moulds clinked and clattered on conveyor systems. Voices carried across the floor, instructions, jokes, gossip, in the flat, warm vowels of York. And beneath it all, the building itself seemed to breathe, the 5-story gravity-fed system moving chocolate steadily downward from raw bean to wrapped product with an efficiency that was almost organic. Workers on the factory floor could eat as many chocolates as they liked. That was the rule. Universal across York's chocolate factories. Eat what you want on the premises, but never, under any circumstances, take them home. It was a point of honour, or perhaps of practicality. Most workers found that after the first week or two, the appetite for unlimited chocolate faded. The smell was so constant, so saturating, that it became invisible, like living next to a railway line and no longer hearing the trains. The company operated as a paternalistic employer. Canteens served communal meals. Recreation rooms hosted jiving during lunch breaks. The firm invested in worker training with a seriousness that went beyond obligation. Dave Blackwell, an engineer, was sent to college for a full year at the company's expense to qualify, then returned to work at the factory until its very last day in 2005. There was a loyalty in that arrangement, a mutual investment. That's difficult to explain to anyone raised on 0-hours contracts and rolling redundancies. At shift's end, workers poured out of the doors like a swarm of bees. One account has it, flooding into the streets of South York, carrying with them the scent of the day's production. You could tell what had been made that shift by the smell on people's clothes. Chocolate orange days had a particular citrus sweetness. All gold days carried notes of rum and caramel. The streets themselves became part of the factory's sensory footprint. An olfactory map of the day's output, drifting through open windows and into kitchens and front rooms. The combined chocolate workforce across York, Terry's, Rowntree's and Craven's reached over 14,000 people at the industry's height. The city didn't just make chocolate, it was defined by it. The air smelled of it. A thick chocolate dust covered every surface as it erupted from the factories. The scent was weather dependent. When the wind shifted, different neighbourhoods caught different notes. On a still summer evening, the sweetness hung over the southern suburbs like a fog. On a brisk autumn day, the roasting notes carried for miles. This was the golden age. Not because people romanticised it at the time. They were just going to work, doing their shifts, collecting their wages, but because everything was aligned. The products were at their best. The workforce was at its largest. The factory was purpose-built and running at peak efficiency. The family still owned the business, and the family still lived within sight of the clock tower. Frank Terry's perfectionism governed the product. Noel, Terry's commercial instincts governed the sales. The community that had grown up around the factory was stable, employed, and proud of what it produced. And the clock tower marked every hour of it. Visible from half the streets in South York, ticking away the shifts, the tea breaks, the overtime, the Christmas rushes. Mother's kitchen clock. Worker's timekeeper. The steady, mechanical pulse of a factory that seemed like it would run forever. The years between 1932 and 1937 represent the absolute summit. The chocolate orange and all gold had launched to extraordinary success. Revenue was growing rapidly. The workforce had reached 2,500. The King and Queen had toured the floor. The clock tower stood tall over a factory that was, by any measure, one of the finest chocolate manufacturing facilities in Britain. If you'd stood in the main hall of the Bishopthorpe Road Works in the autumn of 1937, with the scent of roasting cocoa filling the upper stories and the conching machines vibrating through the floor beneath your feet, you would have seen a business at its zenith. 500 feet of production lines stretching before you. 22 different chocolate centres for the all-gold range alone. A distribution network that reached Australia and New Zealand. A royal warrant. And a product, the chocolate orange, that was quietly working its way into 1 in 10 Christmas stockings in the country. This was the moment, the highest point. But the clock was already counting down to something nobody in that building could see. Within 2 years, war would come. Part of the factory would be requisitioned for aircraft propeller manufacturing. The very floors that roasted cocoa would be used to repair Jablot propeller blades for the Royal Air Force. Sugar and cocoa rationing would strangle production. The workforce would be redirected to the war effort, women filling expanding roles on the phones, the sirens, and the reduced production lines, while the men shipped out. Noel Terry's son Kenneth would be killed in action in 1944. Frank Terry would serve as High Sheriff of Yorkshire in 1945. Chocolate would be manufactured for troop rations and lifeboat supplies, produced under contract for other firms, and shipped to prisoners of war and refugees. Workers smuggled messages of support into tins destined for troops overseas. Little notes, personal, handwritten, hidden among the chocolate. Supervisors reportedly turned a blind eye. It was a small act of warmth in a dark time, and it tells you something about what this factory meant to the people who worked there. It wasn't just an employer, it was a community that expressed itself through the things it made. The war would end. Rationing would eventually lift. Production would resume. The chocolate apple would be quietly retired in 1954, its resources redirected to the orange. The business would stabilise, rebuild and, for a time, thrive again. But the family era was entering its final decades. Frank retired in 1958 and died in 1960. Noel succeeded him, but the business was struggling with the lingering effects of post-war austerity. The factory was modern. It had only been 30 years since the place was built, but the world around it was changing. Supermarkets were replacing small shops. Television was creating national brands overnight. The cost of competing was rising, and a family-owned firm from York, however proud, however skilled, was finding it harder and harder to keep pace. In 1963, the first outside buyer came knocking, and when the Forte Group offered £4,250,000 in shares, the family said yes. The Mayor of York, Mona Armitage, captured the moment with dry Yorkshire humour. Has Terry's been fortified, or Forte's been terrified? It was a good line, But the answer, in the end, was neither. Terry's had been sold, and it would be sold again and again and again. 6 owners in 4 decades, each one paying more for the brand and caring less about the place that created it. The clock tower kept ticking, but the time it was keeping had changed. The golden age was over. What came next was something altogether different. A long, methodical unmaking that one trade union official would later describe, with devastating precision, as death by stealth. The Forte Group bought Terry's in 1963 for £4,250,000 in shares. It was, by the standards of what followed, a gentle transition. Forte modernised the operation, introduced the first television adverts, and kept the factory running. The chocolate still came from Bishopthorpe Road. The clock still ticked. If you lived in South York and walked past the works every morning, you might not have noticed the change at all. But something had shifted. The business was no longer governed by the instincts of a family that lived within sight of the clock tower. It was governed by the calculations of a hotel and catering conglomerate based in London. The relationship between the name on the product and the people who made it had acquired a new intermediary, the balance sheet of someone who'd never set foot on the factory floor. Forte held Terry's for 14 years. Then, in 1977, they sold it to Colgate-Palmolive for £17 million. A toothpaste company, buying a chocolate factory. The logic, presumably, was diversification. Consumer goods are consumer goods, whether they clean your teeth or rot them. At the time of the sale, Terry's held 30% of the UK assortment box market, with All Gold alone commanding 20%. It was a valuable brand. It was also a brand now owned by people whose expertise lay in fluoride and soap. Under Colgate-Palmolive, a chocolate lemon was briefly launched in 1979, a companion to the orange, following the same segmented design. It was withdrawn by 1982. Some ideas work, some don't. The lemon didn't. In 1982, Colgate-Palmolive sold Terry's to United Biscuits for £24,500,000. A management buyout bid was tabled and defeated. The people who actually ran the factory tried to buy it and failed. United Biscuits invested more seriously than its predecessors. A new dedicated chocolate orange production plant was built at the York site, with specialised moulding machinery that allowed precise replication of the wedge structure at high volume. The company expanded internationally, acquired Callard and Bowser and the French firm Chocomets. By 1991, the Terry's Group was making $14.3 million in pre-tax profits on $153 million in sales. It was, by most measures, a healthy business. In 1985, Peter Terry retired. He was the last family member. Over 160 years of Terry involvement in the business that bore their name came to an end. Not with a crisis or a collapse, but with a quiet departure. A man walking out of a factory that his ancestors had built, knowing he was the last one to carry the name through those gates. Then, in 1993, came the buyer that would change everything. Philip Morris, through its Kraft Foods subsidiary, acquired Terry's for £220 million. The business was amalgamated with Chocolate Suchard to form Terry's Suchard. Around the turn of the millennium, the brand was renamed from Terry's of York to simply Terry's, 3 words trimmed to one, and with them, the geographic identity that had anchored the brand to its home city for over 2 centuries quietly severed. 6 owners in 4 decades. Each sale fetched more than the last, from $4 million to $17 million to $24 million to $220 million. The brand was appreciating. The commitment to the place that created it was doing the opposite. Follow the money and you see a pattern. Forte, London. Colgate, Palmolive, New York. United Biscuits, London. Kraft, Chicago. With each sale, the centre of gravity moved further from York, further from the factory, further from the workers who poured chocolate into moulds and wrapped it in foil and sent it out into the world with the letters TERRY''S on every piece. The decisions about what to make, where to make it, and how many people to employ were being taken in rooms that had never smelled of roasting cocoa. And all the while, the clock tower ticked. The workers clocked in. The chocolate oranges rolled off the line. If you didn't look too closely, nothing had changed. The factory was still there. The products were still there. The smell was still there. But beneath the surface, something was being prepared. And the man who would later describe it understood exactly what was happening, even if he couldn't stop it. John Kirk was the GMB Union regional organiser for Yorkshire. He was the workers' negotiator, the man who sat across the table from Kraft's management and tried to hold the line between a multinational's spreadsheets and 300 families' livelihoods. And he had a phrase for what Kraft did to Terry's that is more precise, more damning, and more useful than anything a business analyst or historian has produced. He called it death by stealth. There was a range of 9 or 10 products, Kirk said, and every year they would move one to another site, either in the UK or abroad. 1 product per year. That was the rhythm. Not a single dramatic closure announcement. Not a sudden shutdown that would make headlines and trigger outrage. Just a slow, methodical removal of production lines, each one individually too small to provoke a crisis, collectively amounting to the complete dismantling of a factory. Wafer, Terry's answer to Kit Kat, was moved to Belgium around 2000. Then another line followed, then another. Each time, management offered reassurances. Each time, the workforce shrank a little more. Each time, the factory felt a little emptier, a little quieter, the hum of machinery a little thinner. By the time the formal closure announcement came in 2004, only 3 products remained at Bishopthorpe Road: chocolate orange, all gold, and Twilight. Everything else had already gone, shipped to Kraft facilities across Europe, absorbed into a continental manufacturing network where York was just another pin on a map. But here's the part that cut deepest. Kraft had explicitly promised the trade unions that the production moves were temporary, a consequence of the existing factory's limitations, not a prelude to closure. Kirk was unequivocal. In 2004, Kraft told local management that they were looking for a new purpose-built site in or near York. A new site. In or near York. The production was moving, they said, because the old factory couldn't handle the volume. A new facility would be built. The jobs would be preserved. The commitment to the city was real. Kirk tried to make it work. I talked to them seriously about finding an alternative site, he said, but frankly, they were not interested. Then, later that same year, came the announcement that landed like a door slamming. The entire line was being moved to Poland. Not to a new purpose-built site in York. Not to anywhere in Yorkshire or anywhere in England. To Jankowice, near Poznan, where labour costs were a fraction of what Kraft was paying in York, and where nobody had ever heard of the Knavesmire or Bishopthorpe Road, or the kitchen clock that 2,500 workers had once set their lives by. For us, Kirk said, it was confirmation that Kraft's American owners had been misleading us for a considerable period of time. Misleading. That's the union man's word. Not lying, though the distinction is thin enough to see through. Misleading. Telling workers one thing while planning another. Promising a future while dismantling the present. Moving one product at a time, year after year, until the factory was so hollowed out that closing it could be presented as a practical inevitability rather than what it was. A decision made long before the announcement, executed in stages to minimise resistance. Kirk was blunt about the motive. Moving to Poland was all about saving on employment costs. Kraft are there to benefit their shareholders, and they don't care where or how their sweets are produced, so long as they get the best return on their investment. He added, they had little commitment to the company, its history, or to York and the workforce. Hugh Bailey, the Labour MP for the City of York, drew the contrast that the city itself was living through. Here in York we have had 2 different experiences of takeovers with 2 prestigious confectionery brands, he told Parliament. The way that Nestlé has dealt with Rowntree is very different to the way that Kraft dealt with Terry's. Nestlé has maintained business in York and has invested millions of pounds, Kraft, on the other hand, just wanted the Terry's brand. Just wanted the brand, not the factory, not the workers, not the city, not the skill or the tradition or the 160 years of accumulated knowledge about how to make chocolate that tasted right. Just the name, the lettering on the foil, the orange-shaped outline that consumers recognized. Everything that could be printed on packaging and nothing that required paying York wages. The Spectator, not a publication given to industrial sentimentality, laid it out plainly. When Kraft in 1993 bought another iconic British confectioner, Terry's, maker of the chocolate orange, it promised not to abandon the firm's landmark York headquarters. Yet by 2005, the building had been sold to developers, with production shifted to low-cost facilities in, inevitably, Poland. Inevitably, even the Spectator could see the playbook, and the playbook would be run again. Almost identically, almost immediately. In September 2009, 4 years after Terry's closed, Kraft launched a hostile takeover bid for Cadbury, the Birmingham chocolate maker. During the bid, Kraft publicly stated it was in a position to continue to operate Cadbury's Somerdale factory in Keynsham near Bristol. Continue to operate. The words mattered. They were reported. They were heard by workers. They were taken as a commitment. On the 2nd of February 2010, the takeover completed. 1 week later, 7 days, and Kraft announced that Somerdale would close after all. The reason given was that Cadbury's own plans to wind down the site were too far advanced to reverse. Machinery was shipped to Skarbimierz, Poland. The pattern was identical: the promise, the acquisition, the reversal, the Polish destination. The House of Commons Business Committee investigated. Their conclusion was measured in language and devastating in substance. Kraft had acted both irresponsibly and unwisely. Kraft's chief executive, Irene Rosenfeld, was invited to appear before Parliament. She refused. The committee noted that her refusal fell short of an explicit contempt of the House, but not by much. Not by much. British understatement doing the work of 1,000 editorials. The Cadbury betrayal triggered a formal review of the UK's takeover rules and talk of a Cadbury law to prevent foreign acquirers from making promises they had no intention of keeping. But for the workers at Terry's, the Somerdale saga was not a revelation. It was a repetition. They had watched the same playbook executed on their own factory, in their own city, with their own jobs half a decade earlier. The only difference was that Cadbury was bigger and the outrage was louder. Terry's hadn't been big enough, or perhaps York hadn't been loud enough, or perhaps, and this is the part that sits heaviest. By the time Kraft came for Cadbury, the Terry's closure was already old news. 316 people had lost their jobs in a city that wasn't Birmingham, in a factory that wasn't Cadbury's, and the national conversation had moved on. The playbook worked because it worked the first time, and it worked the first time because nobody stopped it. The 30th of September 2005, a Tuesday. Autumn in York, the light already shortening, the air carrying the first bite of the season. The factory had been dying for months. The formal announcement had come the previous year, giving approximately 12 months' notice. 12 months to wind down a production line that had run continuously since 1926. 12 months for 316 workers to find other employment in a city where one of the two major chocolate manufacturers had just closed its doors. The final weeks were strange. Production tapered. Lines that had once run flat out, Christmas rush after Christmas rush, slowed and stopped. Machines that had hummed for decades fell silent one by one, each shutdown removing another layer of the noise that had been the factory's constant companion. The building grew quieter, and in that growing quiet, the workers could hear things they'd never noticed before: the echo of their own footsteps, the creak of the building settling, the wind through the upper stories where the roasters had once generated their fierce, dry heat. The final chocolate oranges came off the line. The moulds that had shaped 20 segments into a perfect sphere were cleaned, packed, and prepared for shipping. The wrapping machines were dismantled. The conching equipment was disconnected. Piece by piece, the factory's internal organs were removed, labelled, and crated for transport to Poland. On the last day, Ian Bradshaw, who had worked in human resources and payroll for 26 years, was given a tray of 12 boxed chocolate oranges as a parting gift. 12 boxes. One for each pair of years he'd spent in the building. He kept them. For 20 years he kept them, unopened, in their original packaging, a small archive of the last thing the factory ever produced. In September 2025, on the 20th anniversary of the closure, he donated them to York's Chocolate Story Museum. "Terry's was such a family-orientated business," he said, "and I have so many happy memories there. Now these chocolate oranges can help tell that story for future generations." The clock tower stopped. The gents waiting train mechanism, which had ticked since the 1920s, fell silent because there was no one left to maintain it. The four faces reading Terry's York stared out over a factory that no longer functioned, marking a time that no longer mattered to anyone on the premises. 316 workers walked out for the last time. 79 years of continuous production at Bishopthorpe Road ended. 238 years of the Terry's business in York came to a close. The workforce that had once numbered 2,500, that had cheered for the King and Queen in 1937, that had manufactured propeller blades during the war and smuggled notes of support into tins bound for the front. That workforce was gone. The machines went to Poland. The workers went home. And a silence settled over the Bishopthorpe Road site that would last unbroken for years. Local businesses felt it immediately. The owners of the Knavesmire Grill reported that many York residents refused to buy Terry's products after the closure. A quiet, personal boycott that no marketing campaign would acknowledge. Neighbouring shops and cafes that had relied on the factory workforce for their daily trade saw sharp declines. Some closed. The ecosystem that had grown up around the factory, the lunch trade, the morning papers, the after-shift pint, withered without the 2,000 people who'd once sustained it. John Kirk, the GMB organiser who'd fought the closure and lost, offered the verdict that serves as this story's epitaph. The downfall started when the Terry's family sold the first time. The first time, 1963. The Forte Group, £4,250,000. The moment the clock tower passed from the people who'd built it to the people who merely owned it. There's something that nobody talks about when they discuss the Terry's closure, or when they discuss any chocolate factory closing in York. It's not the jobs, though the jobs mattered. It's not the heritage, though the heritage mattered. It's something more elemental, more difficult to quantify, more intimately connected to daily life than any employment statistic. It's the smell. York used to smell of chocolate. Not faintly. Not occasionally. Constantly, pervasively, in a way that defined the sensory experience of living in the city. The air carried it. A thick chocolate dust would cover every surface as it erupted from the city's chocolate factories. The scent was weather-dependent. Wind direction determined which neighbourhoods caught which notes on any given day. On still evenings, the sweetness settled like fog. On breezy mornings, roasting cocoa drifted across streets and through open windows and into bedrooms and kitchens and school playgrounds. Nestlé, which still operates the former Rowntree's factory in the east of the city, later launched a Twitter account to track which parts of York would smell of cocoa on any given day using weather station data. That's how much it mattered. The smell was worth forecasting. When Terry's closed, the southern suburbs lost their share of that scent. The roasters on the upper floors went cold. The conching machines stopped releasing their warm, fatty cocoa butter vapour. The wrapping rooms no longer breathed out their sweet, tempered chocolate warmth. The air around Bishopthorpe Road, air that had carried the smell of chocolate production since 1926, became ordinary. Just air. The same as anywhere. Multiple residents near the factory have confirmed what you'd expect. The streets no longer carry the aroma. Some chocolate scent persists in the east of the city, where the Nestlé factory still produces Kit Kats, and Aero and Yorkie, 7 million bars a day, which is enough to perfume a considerable area. And artisan operations like York Cocoa Works maintain a small-scale presence. But the defining atmospheric character of the city, the all-enveloping, neighbourhood-by-neighbourhood, weather-dependent chocolate air, has fundamentally diminished. Think about what that means. Not in economic terms, not in heritage terms. In the terms of everyday human experience. A city that smelled of chocolate no longer does. A woman who followed her mother into the trade because she smelled so nice when she came home from work, that woman's grandchildren will never know that scent as anything other than a story. The smell died when the factories closed. And unlike the clock, nobody has found a way to restart it. The site sat largely derelict for 6 years after closure. English Heritage placed all 5 listed buildings on its Heritage at Risk register, the official acknowledgement that structures of national significance were decaying without intervention. In March 2005, 6 months before the factory closed, the buildings had been designated Grade 2 listed, prompted by fears they would be demolished entirely. The listing recognised them as the most complete surviving expression of the importance of chocolate production in York. The most complete surviving expression. That phrase carries weight. It meant these buildings weren't just old. They were the best remaining physical evidence of an industry that had shaped a city for over 200 years. Developer Grantside bought the site in early 2006, beating more than 20 other bidders. They renamed it the Chocolate Works, a nod to history that was at least accurate. An initial development proposal was rejected by the City of York Council. A revised plan for a £165 million mixed-use redevelopment was approved in February 2010, despite objections from the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. What followed was comprehensive. Henry Boot Developments and David Wilson Homes acquired the site in April 2013. Listed buildings specialist PJ Livesey Group handled the main factory conversion, a £38 million redevelopment of the 180,000 square foot 5-storey building into 163 luxury apartments called The Residence. The head office became the Chocolate Works Care Village, a dementia specialist facility. The Time Office, where workers had clocked in and out for 79 years, became Workspace. The Liquor Store, where coffee beans and rum for truffles were once stored, reopened as a bistro restaurant. David Wilson Homes built over 320 new homes across the wider site. The clock tower was converted into 21 apartments, with prices ranging from £264,950 for a one-bedroom flat to £724,950 for a 3-bedroom duplex. Heritage bodies objected. The 20th Century Society argued that turning the clock tower into flats would destroy its character and fail to acknowledge and respect the significance it holds for generations of York families. The National Trust opposed it. York Civic Trust opposed it. A community forum facilitated by Leeds University heard residents suggest alternative uses. Chocolate making, a chocolate restaurant, an art centre, an exhibition space. Someone suggested scuba diving in the water tank. All proposals were overridden. Urban exploration photographs from the derelict period show the factory interior stripped and decaying, tiled walls remaining, but every piece of machinery, every production line, every trace of the manufacturing process long gone. The conversion preserved the monumental exterior. The red brick and sandstone ashlar Art Deco facade remains intact. The Tuscan columns still flank the entrances. The mullioned windows still catch the light. From across the nave's mire, the building looks much as it did in 1930. But step inside and you'll find something that has no relationship to what this building was. Sleek gloss kitchen cabinets where the moulding lines ran. E.g. appliances where the wrapping machines clattered. Fitted wardrobes where workers once stacked trays of Neapolitans. Floor-to-ceiling glazed doors opening onto balconies where the gravity-fed workflow once carried raw cocoa downward through 5 stories of transformation. Underfloor heating where the conching machines shook the building with their slow, grinding pulse. The sound of machinery has been replaced by silence. The smell of roasting cocoa has been replaced by nothing at all. It is, in every meaningful sense, a different building wearing the same skin. The architecture has been preserved. The purpose has been erased. The shell survives. The soul was scraped out and shipped to Poland with the machinery. In March 2023, 18 years after the clock stopped, Smith of Derby clockmakers restored the tower's timepiece. The original gents mechanism had mysteriously disappeared during the derelict years, requiring a complete reconstruction. The four faces reading Terry's York began marking time again. A small museum space was created behind the clock faces, with planned limited public access. A Terry's chocolate orange sculpture stands on the development site. Blue plaques were unveiled in 2017, one at St Helens Square by great-great-great-grandson Anthony Terry, another at the Chocolate Works by Noel Terry's grandson Alexander Terry. The clock ticks again, but it ticks over a building that no longer needs it. Nobody inside those luxury apartments is counting down to the end of a shift. Nobody is glancing up to check whether they're running late for the morning clock-in. The letters TERRY apostrophe SYORK still face outward, but the company they name hasn't operated in this city for 20 years. A clock that once kept time for a community now keeps time for no one. The chocolate orange is still made. 44 million are sold annually across the United Kingdom, Ireland, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. 9 million UK households buy one each year. Sales doubled between 2019 and 2022. They tripled in the United States. The brand, by every commercial measure, is thriving. It just isn't made in York. After the closure, production moved to Jankowice, near Poznan. A Mail on Sunday investigation in January 2010 found the facility to be an anonymous, security-fenced factory producing primarily Polish and Eastern European brands. Milka, Alpengold. Terry's chocolate oranges accounted for just 21% of the factory's output. 4,800 tonnes per year. 3 flags flew at the gate: Poland, the United States, the European Union. No Union flag. Chocolate oranges were not sold in Poland. Few of the approximately 300 Polish workers had ever tasted one. That detail, that the workers making Britain's most iconic Christmas chocolate had never tried the product, tells you everything about the distance between where a brand lives in people's hearts and where it actually lives on a production line. The brand later moved again, from Jankowice to Strasbourg, France, after Carambar & Co. acquired it in 2016. A UK subsidiary, Terry's Chocolate Co., was established in February 2019 in Finchley, North London, an office for a brand without a factory. As of October 2025, the brand sits under Ferrara Candy Company, a Ferrero-affiliated firm based in Chicago, following Ferrara's acquisition of the CPK Group for approximately €240 million. A chocolate that was invented in York, moulded in York, wrapped in York, and sent out into the world from a factory overlooked by a clock tower that spelled the city's name, Mascham. That chocolate is now owned in Chicago, administered from Finchley, and manufactured in Strasbourg. The only connection to York is the word on the packaging and the memory of the people who once made it. And then there's the shrinkflation. In 2016, the chocolate orange was reduced from 175 grams to 157. Then further to 145 grams by 2025. 8% smaller, with prices up 51%. Consumer complaints describe thinner segments with visible gaps where chocolate used to be. The corporate claim that the original recipe has been maintained is unverifiable by anyone outside the company. Loyal consumers insist it doesn't taste the same. Perhaps it doesn't. The recipe is one thing. The machinery is another. The skill of the people operating that machinery is a third. And the intangible accumulated knowledge of a workforce that had been making this particular product in this particular building for over 70 years. The instinct for when the temper was right, when the mould was ready, when the chocolate needed another minute. That knowledge walked out of the door on the 30th of September 2005, and it never came back. Terry's All Gold. The Christmas box that once commanded 20% of the UK assortment market, that Noel Terry had fussed over like a jeweller with a display case, has been discontinued. Terry's Neapolitans, mass-produced since 1899, ended when the York factory closed. Twilight, Pyramid, York Fruits, Wafer, all gone. The range that once stretched to 400 items has been reduced to variations on a single theme. The chocolate orange in different sizes, different formats, different flavours, chocolate mint, chocolate milk, Segsations sharing bags, Easter eggs, ice cream, each one a new way to extract revenue from a shape that Frank Terry perfected in 1932. The brand lives, the product sells, the factory is apartments, the workers are gone, the smell is gone, the range is gone. What remains is an orange-shaped piece of chocolate that arrives in Christmas stockings from Strasbourg, bearing letters that spell out the name of a city it hasn't seen in 20 years. York's Chocolate Story, an interactive museum in King's Square, opened in March 2012. It covers all three of the city's chocolate dynasties, Terry's, Rowntree's, and Craven's. Sundee, with photographs, oral histories from former workers, live chocolatier demonstrations and tastings. It won gold at the Visit England Awards in 2018. York Castle Museum received over 400 objects from the Terry's factory. After closure, photographs, packaging, publicity catalogues and chocolates. The museum partnered with the York Oral History Society to interview former employees, capturing the voices of people who remembered what it sounded like when the conching machines were running, what the air tasted like on the upper floors, what it felt like to clock out on a Friday with a wage packet earned on the chocolate floor. In September 2025, a major community-led exhibition opened. Sugar, Skill and Shift Work. York's Confectionery Workers. Over 50 objects, oral histories, uniforms and retro packaging, running until September 2026. The Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York holds the Terry's documentary archive. Goddard's House, the National Trust property that Noel Terry built within sight of his clock tower, offers exhibitions about the family. These are good things. They preserve something. But there's a difference between preservation and presence, between a museum that tells you what chocolate smelled like and a factory that fills the air with it. Between a blue plaque on a wall and a shift of 2,500 workers streaming through the gates. Between a clock that ticks over luxury flats and a clock that tells a neighbourhood when it's time for tea. Bishopthorpe Road has paradoxically thrived. It won Great British High Street of the Year in 2015. The Times named it one of the UK's coolest places to live. The Chocolate Works development added a co-op, a bakery, a butcher's, a pub, a dental practice, and the liquor store bistro. The area has been transformed. From a working industrial neighbourhood where thousands of people once poured from the factory doors, like bees into a residential district of carefully converted heritage and new-build homes. It is a nicer place to live by most measures than it was when the factory was running. Quieter, cleaner, better amenities, higher property values, no chocolate dust on every surface, no shift change traffic, no works hooter at 6 in the morning. But something is absent, and the absence has a weight that no amount of artisan bakeries can fill. Walk along Bishopthorpe Road today, past the red brick facade that still looks like a chocolate factory from the outside, and you will not smell cocoa. You will not hear machinery. You will not see women pouring from the gates at the end of a shift, carrying the scent of the day's production home to terraced houses where their children are waiting. You will see a clock tower. 4 faces. The letters still there, TERRY''SYORK, restored, repainted, ticking again after 18 years of silence. It tells the time, it tells it accurately. The Smith of Derby mechanism keeps excellent pace. But the time it keeps is different now. It's the time of a residential development, not a factory. The time of people who chose to live here, not people who needed to work here. The time of a building that remembers nothing of what it was. wearing the name of a company that remembers nothing of where it began. 316 workers heard that clock stop on the 30th of September 2005. They were the last people for whom those four faces meant something more than decoration. Something real, something daily, something woven into the rhythm of a working life. The clock ticks again, but it tells a different time,